There has been some discussion in the literature of philosophy of religion, particularly based around the well-known journal Religious Studies, in the last 15 years or so, concerning the question of whether there is an obligation to worship God, and if there is such an obligation, what would the grounds of that obligation be? And what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to try and summarize some of that debate and talk about some of the grounds which have been suggested by contemporary philosophers for the obligation to worship God, and ask how those tie in to our own Jewish tradition, both in terms of some sources in Jewish philosophy, both medieval and modern, and in terms of Jewish liturgy, of the Siddur, and similar documents, which are, of course, reflective of the lived experience of the Jewish people in prayer over many centuries, and are obviously a rich resource for us talking about this subject. So let me just run through very briefly 4 grounds for the possible obligation to worship God, which have been suggested in the recent philosophical debate. The first kind of explanation is called by philosophers creation-based. And the idea is simply that we have an obligation to worship God out of gratitude to Him, simply for having created us, personally for having given us our lives. So that's one ground, the creation-based explanation. A second kind of explanation is called by some philosophers redemption-based. And the idea is not so much that we are thanking God in prayer for giving us our lives, my life itself, but rather I'm thanking God in prayer for redeeming me, in other words, for all the good stuff that He's done for me in my life, or that He's done for my people, or that He's done for people that I'm close to, things that God has done for me in my life. That's what I'm expressing gratitude for in prayer, and that gives me the obligation to pray. A third kind of reason which has been put forward in the contemporary philosophical discussion is called by philosophers the maximal excellence account. And the thought there is that because of God's enormous moral standing, as it were, we tend to focus particularly on God's goodness or on God's holiness. Because God is so good or is so holy, then I have the obligation to recognize that by worshipping Him. And then the last kind of suggestion that I'm going to mention, put forward in the contemporary philosophical analysis of the obligation to worship, is what some philosophers call a command theory. In other words, my obligation to pray is simply because God commands me to do so, in the Torah, in the Jewish context, or in some other context, if we're talking about another faith. So all of these 4 suggestions of why there might be an obligation to worship God have philosophical advantages and philosophical disadvantages. Just to give an example, if we suggest that I should worship God because He is of such great moral standing, because He is so good, because He is, as philosophers like to say, omnibenevolent, as good as could possibly be, beyond all human grasp, then we might ask the question, why don't human beings tend to worship other human beings who we recognize as morally superior to us? Or if I say, for example, that I should worship God, I have an obligation to worship God because He created me, then a philosopher might object to that by saying, but if I hadn't been created, then it wouldn't have been me who wasn't created, it would have been nothing.
because I'm nothing if I'm not created, and therefore I can't really compare myself as not created to myself as created, and therefore strictly speaking can't thank God for my creation, because if I wasn't created, then there wouldn't be a me who wasn't created to compare me to by definition. So all kinds of philosophical advantages and disadvantages to these four theories, four explanations of why it might be that there is an obligation to worship God. When we turn to sources of Jewish tradition, we see multiple attempts to explain why there may be an obligation to worship God, and interestingly enough, we see among others all four of the explanations that I've outlined that feature in the contemporary philosophical discussion. So to begin with the first explanation that we identified, the creation-based justification of the obligation to worship. The father of medieval Jewish philosophy, Sadya Gaon, says clearly in his book of opinions and beliefs that I have an obligation to worship God out of gratitude to God for giving me my life. So that explanation appears there in medieval Jewish philosophy. When we come to the redemption-based explanation of why there's an obligation to worship, we see particularly in Jewish liturgy, in the Siddur, in the Jewish prayer book, many expressions of thanks to God, not for an individual life or collective life in general, but we see thanks to God for past redemptions, for acts of goodness and kindness. For example, the redemption of the Jewish people from Egypt is something that features very centrally in Jewish prayer, in Jewish liturgy, as something that might give us an obligation to worship God. A third feature, the third explanation that we talked about was maximal excellence, God's excellence. And there we see God's moral qualities emphasized in Jewish liturgy. We have, for example, the famous verse in Psalms, Hodu Lashem ki tov, give thanks to the Lord because he is good. So there we have God's goodness as a reason for praising him, and similar statements in other texts. And when we come to the fourth theory that we outlined in the contemporary philosophical discussion, which was the obligation to worship God because of his command, we see that as well, interestingly, both in medieval and modern Jewish philosophy and in our liturgy. In medieval philosophy, famously, Maimonides was a major player in the medieval debate, the first to introduce the idea that the Torah itself, the Hebrew Bible itself, commands us explicitly to worship God, to serve God, which Maimonides takes as including the obligation actually to pray and to worship. So Maimonides takes our obligation to pray as being the result of a direct command to God, from us to God in the Torah. And this is an idea which has been very much developed and emphasized by one of the greatest Jewish philosophers of the 20th century, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. And we get this idea as well, interestingly enough, in one of the most famous Jewish prayers of all, the Aleinu prayer, which we say at the end of the prayer service, where we say, Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon hakol, it is incumbent upon us, or we have an obligation to give praise to the Master of all, to God. And that's a really interesting prayer in which, as it were, within prayer itself, we are reflecting on whether there might be an obligation to pray, and we're saying within a famous prayer that we have an obligation to pray. And that particular prayer goes on to suggest why we have an obligation to worship God. But it's fascinating that we have this reflective prayer system in Judaism, and which within it It reflects on why there might be an obligation to pray, why there might be all kinds of reasons for worshipping God. So that, in a very brief nutshell, is an attempt to bring together contemporary philosophical debate about the grounds for being obliged to worship God with some of the rich resources, both philosophical and liturgical, of Jewish tradition.